The Memorial Lecture is in honour of Professor E.S. Meyers, one of the founding fathers of the University of Queensland School of Medicine. Professor Meyers was a doctor, a surgeon, and a passionate advocate for education, and a man who derived joy from learning. Born in Brisbane, Professor Meyers, more affectionately known as Joe, trained in New South Wales, later returning home to undertake his residency at the Brisbane General Hospital. During his career, Professor Meyers was a general surgeon and teacher of unmatched ability. He taught anatomy and surgical dissection to dental students in Brisbane, establishing an anatomy school within the dental hospital on George Street. From early in his working life, Dr. Meyers brought his strength of personality to bear, advocating for the need to establish a School of Medicine in Queensland, a triumph which was achieved finally on the 13th of March 1936. Professor Meyers became medical dean in 1941 and was one of 2 Australians invited at the time to speak at the inaugural conference of the World Medical Education Association.
His passion for education was infectious, and students couldn't help but be swept up by his enthusiasm for learning. He was well loved and respected by the student body. As such, in July 1957, a year after his death, the UQMS established the E.S. Meyers Memorial Lecture to honour his contributions to medicine and to his role as one of the most significant founding fathers of the medical school in Queensland. The lecture has continued through these 61 years, and today, the E.S. Meyers Lecture is one of the largest of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. It is a special time when UQ medical students invite the University and Brisbane community to share with them the joy of learning and celebrate the ethos of Professor Meyers. Throughout the years, we have had the privilege of hearing from leaders in the fields of medicine, science, politics, government and literature, and we are certain that tonight's speaker will be a worthy addition to this list. Professor Meyers' legacy still shapes the education and experiences of those lucky enough to study medicine at UQ. However, this legacy is not born only through events like this one, but also through the family, friends and colleagues who knew the man. We are very fortunate to remain in contact and have the support of the Meyers family, many of whom are here tonight. We welcome you to this lecture and acknowledge your ongoing support for our event, including through the creation of an endowment fund to support the lecture into the future. We'd also like to thank the sponsors, Avant, Walsh's and BOQ Specialists, without whom this event would not be possible.
Each year, the E.S. Meyers Lecturer selects a cause to support via donations collected on the evening. This year, our speaker has chosen to support the work of Associate Professor Sebastian King at the Royal Children's Hospital and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne. Professor King is a paediatric colorectal surgeon with a research focus that includes Hirschsprung's disease, esophageal atresia, and the use of 3D printing in paediatric surgery. We're very pleased to support Ms. Sales in our ongoing commitment to Professor King and his research, and we will be accepting donations from attendees at the conclusion of the lecture. Medical education comprises many different elements, and the UQ Faculty of Medicine would not be able to produce its top quality graduates without high quality clinical teaching and support staff. These people are crucial in teaching medical students not only the curriculum and knowledge necessary for our professional careers, but also the informal lessons and role modelling needed for our growth and development as clinicians and future leaders. I would like to call upon the UQMS President, Ms. Lauren Peck, and Vice President Internal, Ms. Catriona Johnston, to present the UQMS Teaching Awards.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is our great pleasure to be here tonight to present the UQMS Clinical Teaching Awards at this, our premier academic event. Our medical program is supported by a vast number of preclinical and clinical teachers and other staff members who put their heart and soul into our education, helping us to be better future doctors. We have 5 award recipients tonight. Unfortunately, some of the award recipients could not be here, but we will recognise them nonetheless. The first award for tonight is the UQMS Award for Excellence in Teaching Preclinical. This award recognises the work of our lecturers, teachers, clinical coaches and mentors in Phase 1 of our program. The winner for 2018 is Dr. Lorcan Ruan. Students have said Dr. Ruan deserves this award because he went far above his role of clinical coach, acting more as a mentor to all of us. He not only showed extra initiative in teaching us by printing and even reading our clinical handbook, referencing it in his teaching, applying its instructions in practice with his own experience, etc., but he also spent extra time to sit down with us and give individual feedback and information about what it means to be an intern. Congratulations, Dr. Wan. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here tonight. The second award for tonight is the UQMS Award for Excellence in Teaching Clinical Years. This award recognises the work of preceptors, lecturers, tutors and mentors in Year 3 and 4 of our medical program. Year 3 and 4 students are invited to nominate teachers for this award. It is my absolute pleasure to announce the winner for 2018 is Dr. Akram Khalil. Students have said, in every interaction with patients and staff, he makes sure everyone knows everyone else before the surgery begins. From nursing students to anaesthetic consultants, you are all encouraged to introduce yourself by not only your first name, but you are also made to feel valued in the room. He actively encourages students to ask questions and participate, regularly taking time between patients to teach. Congratulations, Dr. Khalil. We would like to invite you to the stage to receive this award.
Congratulations from John and from us all. Wonderful.
The third award for tonight is the Meyers Memorial Award for Excellence in Surgical Teaching. Mervyn George Neely was a senior consultant surgeon and clinical teacher who was held in the highest esteem by his students, peers and patients. In this tradition, and to honour Dr. Neely's contributions, the UQMS established this tribute memorial award in 2001 to be awarded annually to an outstanding surgical teacher. We are also incredibly fortunate to have some of Dr. Neely's family in the room tonight. The winner for 2018 is Dr. Andrew Riddell. Students have said, he was genuinely warm, kind and enthusiastic, and he cared about our progress. We were always welcome in his clinics, theatres, and for coffee with surgical pearls imparted at every opportunity. He has only been at Redcliffe Hospital for a brief period, but I believe he has implemented significant positive change to the hospital in terms of culture and teaching and deserves recognition for his efforts. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here tonight, but we'd like to congratulate Dr. Riddell.
Our fourth award tonight is for the UQMS Award for Excellence in Medical Teaching. This award recognises the work of preceptors, tutors and mentors during the general medicine and medical specialty courses of Phase 2. The winner for 2018 is Dr. Kimberly Pearson. Students have said, Dr. Kim Pearson is the friendly face and generous teacher that makes our medicine experience a calm and welcoming place to learn. She shows immense respect for patients, colleagues and students, making everyone feel a valued part of the team. Our presence feels worthwhile. Dr. Pearson takes time to share her knowledge and her resources, going out of her way to prepare useful handouts and tutorial material, and all our questions are met with encouragement and a keenness to teach. We want to show our support for the impact she has made for so many of us on the Sunshine Coast by nominating her for this award. Unfortunately, Dr. Kim Pearson is unable to be with us tonight, but we'd like to thank her in her absence. Our fifth and final award is the UQMS Award of Excellence in Administration. Our medical program would not function without our administration staff, whose hard work is often unrecognised and unseen. Although it may sometimes be a point of contention, we would like to recognise the efforts of the administration staff at our faculty who operate the basis of our medical program, and without whom our medical education would not be possible. The winner for 2018 is Ms. Cameron Camarinos. Students have said, Kathy always goes above and beyond for the students under her care. She really takes the time to get to know the students and listens to their concerns and suggestions. She makes a stressful rotation run smoothly and has a genuine interest in student well-being. Kathy's smiling, friendly face and approachable manner is an absolute credit to the Faculty of Medicine. Her kindness, as well as efficiency as a student coordinator, makes her a wonderful student coordinator and a perfect recipient for this award. Congratulations to Ms. Camarinos. We would like to invite Ms. Camarinos on stage to receive this award. That concludes our teaching awards for tonight.
Thank you, Lauren, Katrina, and Professor. And congratulations once more to all of the UQMS award winners. To introduce tonight's speaker, we would now like to call upon the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, representing the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, Professor Jeff McCullough.
So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, but also acknowledge the extraordinary role that Indigenous staff and students play in our programs and in our research, and our commitment to addressing some of the issues around Indigenous engagement and Indigenous health. So I'd like to make a special welcome to Leigh Sales, our special guest for tonight, and I'll talk a little bit more about Leigh in a moment. I'd also like to welcome members of the E.S. Meyers family and members of the University of Queensland Medical Society, also UQ colleagues and students, and ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'd like to begin by just talking a little bit about what's just happened. It's incredibly important that we acknowledge our teachers. Sometimes in the life of the university, things get in the way of our realisation that an enormous product of the university, and particularly a medical school, are our graduates, and our teachers are absolutely central to that. So the 5 awards that we've given today are very special, very important to the faculty and very important to the students. I've spent a lot of time in medical education, and the role of enhancing and rewarding and acknowledging our teachers is an incredibly important about. So I join with others in congratulating our 5 winners, but all of those that are involved in the pursuit of teaching our students, because it is incredibly important. I'd also like to thank members of the extended Meyers family for their wonderful and continued support to the University of Queensland and to the broader community. This annual lecture is one of the longest running student organised events at UQ, and as a relatively new Executive Dean, I'm learning the history of UQ, and obviously Professor Meyers was a very important part of that history. The longest serving Dean, 12 years, I'm not sure I'll quite make that, but obviously made an extraordinary contribution. The other people I would like to acknowledge are the 3 organisers of this lecture, in Aslan, Sallyanne and David. These things are not trivial tasks to do, and I very much appreciate the work that you've done around this. So to introduce our speaker for tonight, and I'm going to say that I'm an absolute ABC devotee. I and my wife who's here today would acknowledge this. I'm probably a little bit wireless and podcast connected, but the Listen app is my friend. And so to have someone from the family of the ABC at a time in which the ABC's had some interesting events, but it is such an important part of the culture and the discourse of Australia, and I've been very warmed by some of the ads done by Tim Minchin and others that sort of send this message of just how much it's been a part of what we do. So I feel very privileged to be able to introduce Leigh. So Leigh is an award-winning author and journalist at the ABC and currently anchors the primetime flagship program 7:30. Hailing from Queensland, she holds a Bachelor of Journalism and a Masters in International Relations from the Queensland University of Technology, our sister university here in Brisbane. We're happy to say that. Good collaborations had by all. From 2001 to 2005, she was the ABC's Washington correspondent, covering stories which included the aftermath of September 11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2004 US presidential election, and Hurricane Katrina. From 2006 to 2008, Leigh was the ABC's national security correspondent before becoming the anchor of Lateline, where she interviewed such major figures as Hillary Clinton, Tony Blair and Henry Kissinger. In 2005, Leigh won a Walkley Award, Australia's highest journalistic honour, for her coverage of the Guantanamo Bay and the case of David Hicks. In 2012, Leigh was again honoured with the prestigious Walkley Award for her work on 7:30. Leigh's first book, Detainee 002, was released to widespread critical and commercial success in 2007, winning the George Munster Award for Independent Journalism and being praised by the New York Review of Books for investigating US policy at Guantanamo Bay. Her other works have been published in The Monthly, The Bulletin, The Australian, The Age, The Sydney Morning Herald and The Diplomat. Her second book, On Doubt, was published in 2009 as a part of the Little Books on the Big Ideas series, with a second edition being released in 2017 with an updated section about the Trump post-truth era. Yes, essential reading. Her highly anticipated third book, Any Ordinary Day, was published this month. Leigh is a sought-after public speaker and has appeared at the Lowy Institute for International Policy, the Sydney Institute, the National Press Gallery and the Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne Writers' Festivals. Alongside her friend and colleague Annabelle Crabb, Leigh hosts the podcast Chat 10 Looks 3, where they discuss what they're reading, watching, cooking and listening to. So it's with enormous pleasure I invite Leigh to present this 2018 E.S. Meyers Lecture.
Such a warm welcome, thank you very much. I heard that chatter wherever you are. You're not really a chatter if you haven't baked, I'd just like to point out. Brought some treats for me for later. It's a great honour to be here to do this lecture tonight in the name of E.S. Meyers, who clearly made an incredible impact and difference on the life of not just people who attend UQ, but on the broader community. So it's really an honour to be invited to do that. I just thought I'd also say, why did I want to support the work of Associate Professor King at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne? It's partly because, as a lot of you in this room would probably be aware, certain medical conditions and research for certain conditions tend to attract more donations and funding than others. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. It can be due to the prevalence of those conditions in the community. It can be due to particularly high-profile people lending their name to causes. And it's also dependent sometimes on people who've had, a heart attack or breast cancer or whatever, being willing to talk publicly about them. If you work in an area that is considered embarrassing, it's much harder to get the kind of publicity that you need to attract donations. And so that's one of the reasons there's been late diagnosis of bowel cancer for many years, because people feel embarrassed by it. And paediatric colorectal disorders can be particularly awful things because they have a huge impact on the quality of family life and also a huge impact on the quality of life for children who have things like Hirschsprung's disease. And there's a high correlation as well with psychological problems because of the nature of the physical problem. And so it's a difficult thing to raise money for, of course, because nobody, if their child has a paediatric colorectal disorder, wants to put their child up as the pin-up for that. And so Sebastian King does some awesome work in this field in Melbourne. And so I've been looking for things, and with Chat 10 we also look for things that maybe don't get the attention they deserve and try to back them. And we also felt that his work is a good thing for us to back at Chat 10 because, malfunctioning bums, not very cool. Chat 10, not very cool. So it seemed like a good natural fit. So that's why I endorse the work that he does. Tonight, though, I'm talking about something different. I've been a journalist for 25 years and I've reported every kind of story that you can imagine. Cyclones, floods, political upheaval, sporting scandals, criminal cases, you name it. I've seen human beings face every kind of challenge that life can throw at them, and I've seen all the different kinds of ways people respond. And tonight I want to tell you the main thing that reporting all of that has taught me. It's that the day that turns a life upside down usually starts like any other. You open your eyes, swing your body out of bed, eat breakfast, get dressed, leave the house, close the front door behind you, never having a tingle of unease that something is off, that today is not the ordinary day that it appears to be. Later, when the story of what happens next comes to be told, it will often start with the day's deceptive ordinariness, something that in hindsight will seem unbelievable. In late 2014, I anchored 2 stories on 7:30 that were about events that happened on days that began in the most ordinary ways imaginable, but that were so inconceivable in the way that they ended that they rattled every one of us. On the afternoon of November the 25th, a beautiful day, much like today in Brisbane, a young cricketer, Philip Hughes, was fatally struck by a ball during a game. And on the morning of December the 15th at morning tea time, a gunman took 18 people hostage in a Sydney cafe, and 2 of them, Katrina Dawson and Tori Johnson, were killed by the siege's end. Philip Hughes padded up as he'd done since childhood. Katrina Dawson left her law office to pop downstairs to have a hot chocolate with a friend. Tori Johnson just showed up for a regular day at work. Where was the last sign to exit the freeway, the chance to change course? It feels as if the universe cheated them by not offering that opportunity, that by not giving a sign that this was not an ordinary day, this was a day to stay home, this was going to be a life-changing day. And if the universe, or fate, luck, God, happenstance, whatever you want to call it, didn't offer them that opportunity, then it probably won't offer it to you or to me either. There are choices that we all make in life in the full knowledge that they're going to alter the course of what happens to us, whether to marry or move country or take a particular job or have children. We expect those kind of decisions to have consequences. The confronting thing about the Lindt Cafe siege and the cricket accident and many stories that I've covered over the years was that the choices leading to disaster were so minor that they were barely worth contemplation. What family could possibly imagine that a decision about whether to send their son to soccer or cricket is actually a decision about how long he'll live? Who could possibly function every day if they had to wonder if a decision to have a hot chocolate with a friend was actually a matter of life and death? We each make similar choices and decisions like this every single day, blessedly oblivious to where they might lead. I see every day of my working life that these kind of blindsides level the rich and the poor, the weak and the powerful, without discrimination. It would be unusual for any of us in this room to escape life without one. The only thing that usually varies is the difference in scale, whether it's the type of thing that will land you on a program like mine or not. Are you right now, for example, in the last days of what you might later come to think of as normal life? It's straightforward to grasp the idea intellectually that life can change in an instant, but it's deeply emotionally uncomfortable to be prodded with the sharpness of the reality. And for me, the news stories that dominated the very end of 2014 magnified the deepest truth of being alive, something that is both wonderful and terrible all at the same time. We never know what's coming next. I know rationally that the news is not a mirror held up to life. It's very selective. As one of my journalism lectures at your sister university told my class, 99 helicopters flew safely today. The one that didn't is the one that makes the news. Even so, reporting on awful events every day for years and years has made me fearful about what might happen to me. In December 2014, after Philip Hughes and after the Lindt siege, I would often lie awake at night thinking of this kind of thing and of all the people related to those events who had had their lives turned upside down. I found it hard to contemplate the questions that those kind of tragedies raise. Why them? Why not me? Why not somebody I love? When will it be my turn? Something had happened in my own life at the start of 2014 that undoubtedly contributed to my fear that my number had to be up at some stage. In February that year, I was 8 months pregnant, and I woke up one night with a sharp pain in my side and the sense that just something was not right. I already had one child, so I knew that it wasn't labour pain. I headed to the hospital and the doctors ran various tests and the baby's heartbeat was fine, so I was admitted for monitoring. They didn't really know what was going on. There was some speculation, or maybe it's appendicitis or something weird. After a while, a couple of ultrasound technicians arrived and they were facing me, and I could see by their faces when they saw the image that something was definitely wrong because they looked quite ashen. And I said, "What's wrong?" My pain at that stage was about 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, and I said, "What can you see?" And they said, one of them said, "We can't really see anything. There's a dark substance blocking the view," which I assumed that must be blood. So my obstetrician arrived not long after. I was 37 weeks pregnant, and said, "I think we'll just take you to theatre and get the baby out. We don't know what's going on, but we'll just cut vertically up, and once we get in there and see what's happening, I'll call in whatever specialists are required." So he left to scrub up, and within a couple of minutes I was just floored by this utterly blinding pain, and it felt like my ribs were cracking one after the other. I was trying to not breathe as the slightest movement was excruciating. I still had the fetal heart rate monitor around my stomach, and I heard the midwife said, "I've lost the baby's heartbeat," and she smacked a button on the wall. I unfortunately stayed conscious right through all of this. I wished to be unconscious, partly to escape the physical pain, but also because it was just really terrifying. I'm sure for medical people, when you have an emergency like that and everyone comes running, it's ordered, but when you're not a medical person, it seems not ordered. It seems like pandemonium. And so that is very scary when you're the person at the centre of it. I was raced to theatre. I remember the lights flashing over my eyes. I remember somebody reaching under the sheet to hold my hand. The last thing I remember seeing is my obstetrician walk in as somebody else was drawing a line up my stomach where they were about to cut. I was begging the anaesthetist to knock me out. It was awful. When I woke up, there was no baby to be seen. I was on my back in a dimly lit room. It was a high dependency unit. I could sense there was a tube going up one nostril, which was very uncomfortable, and I learned later it was running down the back of my throat into my stomach, pumping fluid out. There was another tube coming out of the wound on my stomach, and a catheter, obviously. I had tubes coming out of both hands, attached to drips on either side of the bed, oxygen prongs in my nostrils, just the full catastrophe. I learned later that the baby was in the neonatal intensive care unit and that he'd been deprived of oxygen for a period, and there were fears that he could have brain damage, and so they were doing what they could to mitigate against that. I'd had a uterine rupture, which I'm sure, as you would all know here, is when it's exactly as it sounds, the contents of your uterus spill into your abdominal cavity. I'd lost a massive amount of blood. I'd had 3 transfusions during surgery. The doctors were now very worried about the functioning of all of my internal organs because there'd been just so much blood, and it sounded from how they described it to me that it was pretty much, I had to be hosed out to try to get all of that out of there. And so I was very unwell. I was, of course, also numb with shock about what had happened. I was numb with shock about the baby and what the situation was going to be there. I broke down crying hysterically a couple of days after surgery, and the nurses took pity and wheeled my whole bed and all my attachments down to the NICU, where he was hooked up to all of his paraphernalia. The first photograph of us together, unlike most people's baby photos, is just pathetic. You can hardly see him under all the gear. I am genuinely unrecognisable. I didn't understand it at the time because I was just dealing with what was right in front of me, but that experience caused me to a degree to lose my sense of security in the world and to a degree my sense of self. Because in my mind, here was I, this supposedly competent, or by reputation very competent, independent person, and here was I not only unable to look after myself, but also unable now to care for my children. And the person that I considered myself to be, self-sufficient, in control, was nowhere to be seen. And although I knew that it was irrational, in my head I knew it was irrational, I felt ashamed and weak. That experience changed me profoundly, and the view of my life from after that couple of weeks in hospital was not the same as the view of my life from before. The world didn't seem as safe as it once had, and the idea of a catastrophe didn't seem like something that happens to other people. It seemed more real and not something that was distant. I felt very destabilised. And I should reassure you that the baby was fine, amazingly. He has been not shown any signs of any issues from that. That experience amplified for me the questions with which the news confronts me every night. How do we come to terms with the fact that life can blindside us in an instant? When the unthinkable does happen, what happens next? How does a person go on? Do we as a community have any sort of obligation to people who unwittingly find themselves in the centre of a blindside kind of story about which we want to know more? And once we truly understand that we are not exceptional and that instead we are just as vulnerable as the next person, what does that tell us about how we should live? All of us will experience grief and suffering as part of the human package. I dread all the anticipated losses of life, the death of parents, all the things associated with ageing. But those prospects don't terrify me as much as the idea of something unexpected coming along that turns life upside down instantly. I was scared of it. I tried to avoid watching stories like that on my own program. I've preferred to cover politics for most of my career rather than general news, so I could avoid thinking about those kind of things. What prompted me to begin writing my new book, Any Ordinary Day, was the thought of what might happen if I walked towards what I most feared rather than in the opposite direction. What would I learn if I spent time with people who had lived through some of the things I most feared happening to me or my family? What could the newest scientific research teach me about the way the human brain comes to terms with such things? It felt to me like staring at the sun. I was scared of doing it. I was worried I'd get hurt, but I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't look away. During the writing of Any Ordinary Day, I met some incredible people, some of whom you will have heard of and some of whom you won't. People share the most extraordinarily intimate details of their lives with me. I really do think it's some of the best interviews I've ever done. But it's not a book that's a series of interviews or a series of stories. It's more a book about what's happened to me, exploring these questions and what I've learnt through that exploration and how I've come to terms with the idea that life can change suddenly for the worse and that almost certainly tragedy in some form will come for every one of us. For me, one of the most fascinating things I had a chance to look at was the cutting-edge psychological research into why we think the way we do about the kind of blindsides that land on the news. For example, when we see something like the Lynch siege, it's pretty universal to think, oh, that could happen to me, something like that could happen to me. Or when there's a tragedy like the Dreamworld roller coaster accident that tragically claimed those 4 people's lives, we think, oh, I'll never go on a ride like that ever again, even though we take statistically more significant risks every day, for example, by driving our own cars. Or why does the death of Philip Hughes rattle the whole community, even though we don't personally know him, and even though we don't play cricket, chances are we don't play cricket at the kind of elite level where you would have a risk of being struck in the head fatally by a ball. There is amazing research out there that answers all of these questions. For all of recorded time, human beings have been fascinated by the intersection of destiny and chance, and we've craved ways to test and tame the fates. We hate to feel vulnerable, and we seek reassurance any way we can. We read horoscopes, pray to gods, visit clairvoyants, consult tarot cards, check weather forecasts, scour news stories about our chances of contracting various diseases and things we can do to mitigate against it. Gambling can be dated back to 3500 BC, thanks to an ancient form of dice uncovered during an archaeological dig in Egypt. And gamblers, along with people whose jobs involve precision, luck or high risk, surgeons would be among them, sports stars, soldiers, actors, frequently turn to superstitious rituals for protection. It's not just them either. I can't tell you how many times I've been approaching a red light and thought, if it turns green before I stop the car, I'll land that interview with the Prime Minister for tonight. If it's such that I have to stop the car, okay, best of 3. We all do stupid things like that to try to have a sense of control over our world. We ascribe significance to the most random, meaningless events for that reason. Human brains have evolved to need predictability. Our ancient ancestors had to make dozens of decisions every day that went to their very survival. What food was good to eat, what shelter was safe from elements, what locations were safe from predators. Predictability was useful because it streamlined that decision-making process. So if a plant had been safely eaten before, then it could be safely eaten again. The need for predictability was so strong that evolutionary biology has caused our brains to permanently require it. The brain gathers all sorts of information from the outside world and stores it as memories. And memories then help us make decisions about how to act by evaluating past experience against present reality. And that mental process occurs in a split second for something that we've done a ton of times before, like walking up some stairs, or it can be much slower for something that's more complex, such as, should I trust this person or not? The brain loves patterns that it can recognise because they foster predictability in the world around us and help us eliminate unpleasant feelings of insecurity or unfamiliarity. Lots of experiments have demonstrated the brain's preference for predictability over unpredictability. In one study, monkeys were given a choice of two coloured targets. Only one of the targets gave information. They could see what the reward was that was coming. And after a few days of training, they showed a clear preference when they could see what was coming. There was an experiment with human beings where people were found to prefer pushing a button that would deliver a small guaranteed electric shock than pushing a button that might or might not give an electric shock. So, in other words, people feel better about knowing for sure what's coming, even if it's painful, than not knowing. There's a chemical reason as well as a biological one for this preference for certainty and predictability. When our brains receive information that makes sense, they behave in the same way as when we reward any other craving, which is by releasing dopamine, which is the chemical that makes us feel pleasure. When dopamine's produced, the body feels calm, content, comfortable, relieved, and safe. Uncertainty feels closer to pain, and so the body will try to avoid it. Different people, of course, have differing levels of tolerance for uncertainty. The human bias towards predictability makes us look for cause and effect in the world around us, even for things that defy explanation. So when you see something like the Lindt Cafe occur, there'll always be news stories with people talking about things like, oh, I should have been there, but I changed my plans at the last minute. And it's like we're looking for a reason why things happen. A lot of people find it a reassuring thought that somewhere out there is a blueprint dictating the course of our lives, even if we can't see it. There's a greater sense of certainty in believing that things happen for a reason, that they're under some form of control, whether it's our own or somebody else's. For many people, it's comforting to believe that factors such as how hard we work, the choices we make, or the goodness of our deeds influence our destiny more than luck and chance do. Does this kind of thinking square with the evidence, though? Many life-changing events, and even just arbitrary, everyday ones, are completely arbitrary. The 18 people in the Lindt Cafe didn't do something to deserve to be there, while you or I did not. They weren't meant to be there. The brain wants an explanation so it can satisfy its desire for cause and effect. Something like the Lindt Cafe shatters our individual feeling of security, because how do we know we won't be in a cafe when a terrorist takes people hostage, and the brain wants the feeling of stability and order and security restored. Most unusual events, like being the victim of a terrorist attack, can be at least partially explained thanks to a mathematical theory called the law of large numbers. When you take an enormous group of people, a sample, the chance of an extremely rare event occurring is greatly magnified. A 1 in a million chance of something happening to you on paper looks pretty unlikely, but Australia's population is 25 million. And so if every year just a single 1 in a million event happens in Australia, 25 Australians will be that one. 25 seems like quite a lot of people. The law of large numbers explains why something that might feel highly significant to you personally may not in fact be that unique. Say you dream that a friend died and the very next day you found out that that friend had indeed died. You would no doubt find that extremely memorable and think that it signified something. Yet in 2003, a British statistician calculated the odds of dreaming of a friend's death on the night that it actually happens. He based his maths on Britain's population at the time, which was 55 million, which is a gigantic sample, and he assumed an average of one dream of a friend's death per lifetime. He then factored in the national death rate of 2,000 every 24 hours. Crunching those numbers, the odds of an accurate death dream in Britain are 1 every 2 weeks. I know, it's sort of hard to believe, isn't it? Given the size of the global population, 7.5 billion, the law of large numbers means that Lint Cafe style events are sadly common. What it doesn't mean is that we are more likely to be in one ourselves. Our planet is the ultimate large sample. With so many of us, any one individual's chance of being the victim of the kind of blindside that lands on a program like mine is still really small. Our brains make the prospect seem more likely than it actually is because they're putting the unusual events, the ones that defy past patterns, in neon lights because we've evolved to think that the unusual things are threatening to us because they defy predictability. If the chance of an awful random disaster affecting any one of us personally is remote, why are we so rattled by them? And why do we worry about them happening to us? As with the brain's preference for predictability, the answer lies with evolutionary biology, which, along with our personal experience, is a key reason that we draw the conclusions we do. Until about a millisecond ago in the span of human history, we lived together in small tribes. We stayed with the same people from birth until death. Our ancestors faced potentially catastrophic threats from things that are no longer much of a threat to us in the modern Western world. Darkness, snakes, spiders, large cats and other predators, being alone, being exposed in an open space. Over many centuries, humans have evolved to internalise fears of those things, and they remain some of the most common human fears today. Our ancestors had great cause to fear situations and events that could claim many lives at once and possibly wipe out most of a tribe's population. Safety was in numbers, and the chances of survival improved with the size of the tribe. New threats, or things that hadn't been previously experienced, were particularly terrifying because the tribe couldn't prepare a response. Humans living today are genetically programmed through evolution to fear blindsides and disasters that result in mass casualties. By looking at how our brains have evolved, scientists and psychologists have been able to map many of our common fears according to what they call dread risk. An event that's uncontrollable, unfair, unfamiliar, unimaginable, causes huge suffering, or leads to simultaneous fatalities is considered to have high dread risk. Events with high dread risk are things like chemical warfare, terrorism, gun massacres, plane crashes. Low dread risk events include smoking, death from smoking, or falling from a ladder. Thanks to biology, events with a high dread risk scare us more than things with a low dread risk, even though the low are statistically more likely to cause death or injury. We know the dangers of smoking and the dangers of climbing ladders, but they feel like things we can control, unlike the question of where a terrorist might detonate a bomb. The high dread risk of situations that claim many lives at once versus the low dread risk of things that claim more lives but spread over a longer period of time is why many of us are more scared of the plane flight than of the drive to the airport, despite the latter being statistically a far greater danger. It's what makes nuclear accidents more gut-churning than obesity. We watch an event like the Lint Cafe siege on the news and we feel extremely vulnerable, even though the more probable risk to our personal longevity is whatever we're eating or drinking while we're watching the news. Our reaction is thanks to the threats our ancestors faced and the way that we're now wired as a result. As well as some of the research, I wanted to tell you about some of the people that I met during the writing of this book. One of the main things I've tried to do is ask questions that we would all like to ask, but that in real life it would feel inappropriate or just socially unacceptable to do so. For example, when somebody has lost their entire family, what stops them from killing themselves? When you arrive home from work and the police are waiting at your house to tell you that your husband's been killed, what happens next? Do they come in? How long do they stay? How do they actually break that news? And what if you're the police officer who has that job? What's that like for you? Do you follow a game plan? Is there any predictability in the way people react? Often I would meet a person and they would say that when something dreadful had happened to them, it felt like they'd been plonked into a foreign land. And in that foreign land, they would sometimes meet people who seemed to speak the language and would be helpful. And so then I would track down those people and talk to them too. One person I met who was really fascinating is the person I described before. He was a detective with the New South Wales Homicide Squad. So he was somebody who frequently had to go to people's houses and tell them that a loved one had been killed. His name was Graham Norris. I'd interviewed a woman named Juliet Darling whose partner had been murdered by his son who was mentally ill. And the son went on the run and Graham Norris came in and he was running the manhunt for the son, and then he was involved when the son was apprehended in the trial and the coronial inquest that came later. Graham Norris was a really fascinating guy. I could not have imagined doing his job for 1 second. He'd been a late starter in the police. He got into the police force at about age 35 after a career in sales. He just had always had a fascination for it that he couldn't let go. He started off in general duties in Mount Druitt, which is a fairly depressed area in Sydney's southwest, and then he moved into sex crimes, and then he went to homicide after that. I asked him if before he went to homicide, he was scared of things like being around murdered bodies. And he said what he was worried about was he was apprehensive about having to be there to watch post-mortems because he tended to get queasy whenever he had a needle. While I was thinking, mate, huge call to go to homicide. But he said he got around that because he felt that the work was important and meaningful, and he realised that he had the capacity as a human being to do that work and that not everybody does, and he felt that he could make a valuable contribution. I asked him what it was like to go and tell a family that a loved one had been killed. He said it was always really difficult. He called it delivering a death message. He said you get trained for it at the police academy, but that really you mostly learn how to handle it through experience. He said, for example, he learned that when you're delivering news like that, you have to be very, very direct. The human brain will do whatever it can to avoid listening to dreadful news. And so if you say something like, I'm sorry, your son's been in a fatal car accident, a lot of people will say something like, is he okay? Or who died? You have to say, there's been a fatal car accident, your son has been killed. He said you never want to say the words, you never get to that stage. You're always afraid when you have to give news like that how people will respond. But he said there's no predictability. He said one time he went to somebody's house and he said, I'm sorry, your father's been killed. And the person said, that's the best news I've ever had. Would you like to come in for a coffee? Graham, of course, was like, no, I would not like to. I thought that Graham Norris had the most incredibly emotionally intelligent approach to his job. Whenever he was walking from his car to the front door of somebody's house and he knew that he was about to upend their life, he had a principle that would guide him. It was the idea that he was going to have to be the person to help them get to their new normal. They didn't know it yet, but their normal life was about to be shattered. They would want it back, but they would never be able to get it back. And he would try to help them adapt to their new normal. He knew that his association with them was going to last a long time, that there'd be an investigation and then someone might or might not be charged, there might or might not be a trial, there might or might not be an appeal. It's a long process. And so he felt that over time, he would say to them, we have to find a way for you to deal with this new set of circumstances and for you to make a life with that. Somebody else who I spent time with who made a lasting impression was Stuart Diver, the sole survivor of the Thredbo landslide in 1996, arguably the most famous disaster survivor in Australian history. His wife Sally died right in front of him in terrible circumstances. You might think that was Stuart's allotted serving of tragedy for his life, but sadly his second wife Rosanna died of breast cancer. So he's only slightly older than I am, but he's been widowed twice. Stuart helped me to learn how people adapt to horrendous blindsides. When any person faces something like that, they will usually fall apart initially, but eventually and incredibly, most will adapt to their new normal, as Graham Norris put it. Just how long they stay in the first phase and how well they adapt during the second differs enormously. You know, why do some people seem to remain fractured for a long time where other people seem to return fairly quickly to basic functioning? What are the factors that make adaptation more likely? It seems to me from the things that I studied that the things that influence how well we adapt to a game changer can be divided into three groups. The nature of the event itself, our genetics and our internal beliefs about the way the world works. formed, and that's formed, sorry, our genetics is number 2. The third is the way our internal beliefs about the world works, and that's formed largely through our personal history. That the nature of the event itself dictates how well a person recovers seems self-evident, and Stuart Diver's experience proved that point. He said that there was no comparison between watching his first wife die in front of him in shocking circumstances with the death of his second wife, for which he had time to prepare and was much slower to unfold. It's not to say it was easy, it was just not as difficult as the sudden, horrible, violent death in front of him. Many events in life are difficult to process, but some, such as the death of a child or witnessing the violent death of a loved one, are particularly confronting. An event in which a person's own life is seriously and suddenly threatened is also very devastating. Beyond the event itself, our biology and the character traits we inherit from our parents account for about 40 to 50% of how well we adapt to adversity. Stuart said to me, "You can ask my family and friends who knew me before, I'm the same person." He's probably right. He probably already was a fairly resilient, determined and positive person, and those traits would have helped him enormously in coming to terms with what happened to him. The personality traits associated with recovery include optimism, extroversion, hardiness, and a healthy ego. Optimists are more likely, for example, to be able to make meaning of an awful event by concentrating on the good that might come from it. Being optimistic is linked with positive outcomes in numerous studies of affliction, including cancer, heart disease, rheumatic disorders, and HIV. The research is so overwhelming in this regard that it perhaps explains why we live under the tiresome tyranny of positive thinking, as if optimism itself is a miracle cure and not just a coping tool. Telling people they need to think positive if they're not so inclined is potentially harmful, as it can lead to repression and that creates feelings of failure. One influential theory about adaptation is that we're all born with a fixed level of emotional equilibrium and happiness called a set point. It's kind of like an internal spirit level. Good or bad fortune makes it fluctuate in the short term, but then it returns to its original level. There was a very famous 1978 study on this matter where researchers compared 3 groups of people: a control group, a group of lotto winners, and a group of people who'd recently suffered devastating spinal injuries. Short term, winning lotto was definitely a big boost, and losing mobility was obviously devastating. But after a year, things had changed. The lotto winners were not significantly happier than the control group. The spinal cord injury individuals were less happy than both the control group and the lotto winners, but nowhere near as unhappy as they had been straight after their accidents. In 2013, that study was replicated with different groups of people, but including an important change. It looked at people not 1 year after winning lotto or having a spinal injury, it looked at them 20 years later. And over the decades, all 3 groups had adapted to the changed circumstances, and the spinal injury people were not significantly more unhappy than the lotto winners even. Since that original very influential 1978 study, psychologists have raised questions about whether our equilibrium is really as fixed as that and whether we return to the set point. A German study monitored 40,000 people for 21 years and a British one followed 27,000 people for 14 years. And charting such huge groups of people over such long periods of time allowed the researchers to scrutinise the impact of all sorts of major life events: divorce, death, unemployment, loss of children, and the onset of disabilities. Some people did find their set points enhanced or depressed permanently, and it's an area that's very ripe for future research. Along with Stuart Diver's personality, he said another thing during our interview that's key to understanding the process of adaptation. Stuart said that with the help of a therapist, he worked out that before the landslide, he held, in his words, 13 or 16 fundamental beliefs, core assumptions about the way the world worked. All of us, whether consciously or unconsciously, hold these ingrained beliefs called schemas, and they differ for each of us. They form in our earliest years through our personal experience and through what adults teach us. A devastating event smashes a person's schemas, causing a kind of mental car crash. Sometimes schemas are pieced back together again, and sometimes they're destroyed permanently and they're replaced by something else. One person holds many different schemas covering beliefs about justice, control, predictability, spirituality, self-esteem. They might include beliefs like things work out for the best, hard work pays off, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The most common schemas can be classified into 3 categories. The first is about the benevolence of the world, things like if you're a good person, good things will happen to you, or love will ultimately triumph over hate. The second covers how the external world works, such as people get what's coming to them, or your fate is set from birth. The third is about self-esteem, and it might include such ideas as, I must be a bad person because bad things always happen to me, or I've worked hard so I will achieve my dreams. Schemas, whether you're aware of yours or not, powerfully influence your behaviour. They're the filter through which you interpret other people's behaviour, and they help you decide how to act with friends and strangers. They help you to anticipate and plan for the future, and they even govern what you notice and what you remember when new information comes along. What you'll probably remember from my talk tonight are things that reinforce your existing views about the world. We all pay more attention to things that reinforce our own schemas and downplay or negate incoming data that conflicts with them. That's something known as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias helps us remain emotionally and mentally stable. As I explained earlier, humans are predisposed to desire cause and effect. We need explanations for why things happen so that our brains can file it away and move on to thinking about something else. The more something fits with our existing schemas, the easier it is for the brain to file it away. A sudden life-changing event is mentally and emotionally destructive because it shatters schemas and it stops the brain from knowing how to understand or interpret the world. Life may seem confusing. How could something so awful happen to my child? What did I do to deserve this? I'm a good person. When schemas are upended, the human brain responds in one of 3 ways. It can go into denial, shutting down, repressing reaction, and refusing to attempt to process what's happened. What Graham Norris described when people said, who died in the car crash, that's a form of denial. Denial can actually be a useful short-term coping mechanism because it's protective. Our brain can assimilate. It can try to find a way to integrate what has happened into schemas. This happened to Stuart Diver. He learned to think about the final moments with his first wife, Sally, as evidence that he was somebody who cared about people under the greatest possible stress. And that was one of his core beliefs, that he cared about people. So he thought about the way he tried to save her, and he took it that, yes, I still hung to my core beliefs even when I was tested in the most trying circumstances. Denial, assimilation. The third way is accommodation. This is when a person fundamentally changes a core belief about how the world works. You might, for example, no longer believe that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You might believe, in fact, that you are weaker after what's happened to you. The more successfully a person is able to accommodate or assimilate, the better they will be able to adapt to a blind side and move forward. An attempt to make a tragedy fit with our schemas is one of the reasons that we always ask, why me, after something awful happens to us. And in fact, this is a profoundly important question because it's the first step in helping the brain process an event. There are literally dozens of studies cataloguing how many people ask themselves after a traumatic incident, why me? It's almost a universal instinct. And these studies look at the impact that the exploration of that question has on recovery. One of the most influential of these studies involved 29 full-time patients at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. They were aged from 16 to 35. All had become paraplegics or quadriplegics in serious accidents, victims of the kind of random calamity that could happen to any one of us. There were 11 car crashes, 6 diving accidents, 4 shootings, a plane crash, a motorcycle accident, a hang gliding accident, a tumble down a flight of stairs, a dive into a haystack, a high school football tackle. There was a victim of a falling beam of farm machinery, another person also who was hit by a falling piece of machinery. Each case was in itself a rich story of luck and fate and chance in sliding doors. The researchers interviewed each patient along with their doctors and carers to get a sense of how well or otherwise they were coping with the aftermath of their accident. Every single patient had spontaneously asked themselves, why me, as soon as they were able. The answers fell into 6 categories: predetermination, probability, chance, God, deservedness, and re-evaluation of the event as a positive. The most popular answer was that God had a reason and that the person had to trust in that reason, whether or not it made sense to them. Putting the tragedy down to chance was also a very common explanation, along the lines of it was just a freak accident that could have happened to anybody. There was a fascinating correlation in this study between the answers to why me and the ability to cope. The people coping best answered in a way that indicated they believed they couldn't have avoided the accident and that ultimately it was their own fault, not somebody else's. For example, one patient who was managing well said, "It was bound to happen eventually. I've been driving for 15 years. Eventually somewhere there's a fatal accident around." If the activity was something that a person chose to do freely and regularly, they were inclined to see the accident as something that could have happened to anyone and that they were simply unfortunate in it. The people who coped worst were those who were injured doing something they wouldn't normally do. For example, they'd accepted a lift in a car when they normally travelled home on a train, because they saw the accident as something that they could have avoided if only they'd acted like they normally acted, and they found it really hard to stop ruminating on the if only scenario. The brain couldn't file the event away, it kept ruminating. Poor coping also correlated with blaming somebody else for what had happened. Among the worst copers was the sole person who'd not been able to come up with any answer at all to the why me question. It seems that almost any explanation, even one as odd as the devil got into God that night and made God do something wrong, which was one of the patient's offerings, was better as a coping mechanism than no explanation at all. Any story that allows the brain to maintain the illusion that there's an underlying order and meaning to our existence helps with recovery. When the brain keeps ruminating on an awful event, keeping it in what psychologists call the active memory, it torments a person with recurrent intrusive thoughts. And sometimes this is because the gap between what has happened and the person's schemas is too difficult to bridge. And other times the brain can't easily construct new schemas. It doesn't know what to believe after here. And that causes a person to have difficulty moving on. As I've mentioned, short-term, this mental train wreck happens to almost everyone who's shattered by grief or by a terrible event, and most people do adapt over time. But failure to adapt is not uncommon, and it causes predictably dysfunctional behaviour. People can begin to obsess over conspiracy theories, they may ascribe blame or intent when there was none, and they will sometimes write endlessly to authorities or demand inquiries. In legal circles, these people are known as querulous complainants, and they pop up so regularly that the Australasian Coroner's Manual actually has a section on how to deal compassionately with people who become fixated like this. It notes that they are relentlessly driven by a pursuit of justice, their complaints cascade in type and target over the years, and secondarily devastate their own lives. Families can split up and people can lose jobs and also their friends because their brains become stuck on the unfairness or the inexplicability of what's happened to them. When I met Stuart Diver, he said something that was very vulnerable and touched me and made a big impact. He said to me, "Nobody says this to my face, of course, but I know they all say it behind my back. They all say, 'Geez, who'd sign up to be the third Mrs. Diver?'" It's like this idea, and I've had people say it to me about Stuart Diver when I've said I've met him, "Oh geez, that poor bastard, he must be jinxed." Now, I felt really sorry for Stuart that he was aware of this, and I knew that it was true that people say that. And I also know there's no such thing as a jinx. And so I rang up the Australian Bureau of Statistics and said, "Can you please help me calculate the odds that Stuart Diver's future third wife will die before him? I want to test this idea that he's jinxed." And they were fantastic. It was complicated. Stuart lost one wife in an incredibly rare freak event, something for which nobody could possibly blame Stuart Diver himself. Once the landslide was in his past and he remarried, his odds of becoming a widower reset. Unfortunately, Stuart then had the misfortune to lose his second wife to something comparatively common, breast cancer. For women aged 45 to 54, breast cancer is the number one killer. It kills about 1 in 4,000 women annually in Australia. So it was unusual for Stuart Diver to lose his first wife in a landslide, but it was sadly ordinary to lose his second to cancer. You might be thinking, "Oh, hang on, I still reckon losing 2 wives by age 44 is pretty weird." Well, you're right about that. It is unlucky to be widowed twice by that age. In the last census of the Australian population, there are about 8 million adult men. Among them, only 6,000 or so men of Stuart Diver's age or younger were widowers. If it was twice widowed, it would be even fewer. Being widowed twice, though, by age 44 is a little bit like flipping a coin. The loss of Stuart's first wife neither reduced nor increased his chances of losing the second, in the same way that tossing 10 heads in a row does not reduce or increase the chances of tossing a head the 11th time. From the moment you throw the 11th coin in the air, the odds of heads are 50-50. 10 heads in a row does not cause a tails to arrive next. The loss of Sally and then the loss of Rosanna were their own discrete events with no causal link between them, certainly not the tie to Stuart Diver. Nonetheless, like the tossing of 10 heads in a row, the more the same result occurs in a row, the rarer the experience. Let's think about the future now and assume that next year Stuart will meet and marry the third Mrs. Diver. We already know that his background is no shield against the poison darts of fate. A happily ever after ending is not guaranteed. We also know that a tragic past does not make him more susceptible to a tragic future. The third Mrs. Diver will be on her own path, independent of Stuart's history, and so she doesn't need to have any special fear because of her association with him. But what about Stuart himself? What are the odds for him of being widowed a third time? Is having another relationship worth the risk? Let's assume Stuart marries somebody the same age as him. Of every 100 women aged 47 right now, 2.1 of them will die during the next decade, most likely from breast cancer, lung cancer, or suicide. Even if we add some assumptions about the risks to the third Mrs. Diver's longevity purely based on being married to Stuart, for example, she might have an elevated risk of dying in a skiing accident because Stuart's operations manager at Thredbo, so there's a lot of skiing in their life. She might have an elevated risk of dying in a transport accident because he likes travelling a lot, so she'll probably be travelling with him. What she does not have is an elevated risk of dying simply because his first two wives died. There is no jinx. In fact, the next person most likely to be bereaved in the Diver household would be the third Mrs. Diver herself, because the average Australian woman lives a couple of years longer than the average Australian man. The odds favour Stuart Diver dying before his next wife. Good news, Stuart, there. Probability and statistics being complicated matters, it took me more than 2 weeks to crunch the numbers there. And when I wrote those paragraphs in a way that seemed to make sense, I emailed them to Michael Wilson at the Australian Bureau of Statistics to check. And he said, that is a perfect piece of logic, but even with all that work, I bet people will read it and go, yeah, well, I still think Stuart Diver's jinxed. In 2014, after my son's terrifying birth, I started to think that I was jinxed. When he was 6 weeks old, he contracted viral meningitis and we were back in hospital. 2 months after that, another Blindside, not the baby, but his 2-year-old brother. His daycare centre noticed that his hands had a tremor, and he's had lots of, that's been years of doctors and therapists and hospitals, and he has lots of medical challenges to navigate, but that's his story, and I'll leave it for him to tell one day if he wishes. The little one is now a rambunctious 4-year-old. He pretty much runs the house. He's developing neurotypically, which is how I've since learned the medical profession calls a child I would have previously called normal. And then amidst all of that, when it felt like things couldn't get worse, my marriage of 20 years collapsed. When I started thinking about writing this book, I was frightened by what had happened to me and how thoroughly and quickly my life had been upended. I was scared of what appeared on my own television program every night, how fickle and cruel the world often seemed. And I was worried about what might happen to me next. What if something else went wrong? Walk through a children's hospital or host a nightly television show and you'll realise there's always something worse that can happen to you. Lately, I've noticed among friends and even strangers a desire to stop watching or reading the news. The world seems so unstable and dangerous nearly 2 decades into the 21st century that it's easier to switch off and think about or watch things that make us laugh or feel good instead of perpetually anxious. I completely understand that compulsion to look away. And so it seemed strange to me as I embarked on writing Any Ordinary Day that I was choosing to voluntarily to do the opposite, to walk towards pain and suffering, particularly when there'd been this modest measure of it in my own life. Now that I know more about how our brains work, I think that it was perhaps an effort to impose control. I think subconsciously I thought if I could understand the things that rattled me, perhaps I could harness my own fear. Even so, at the start of the process, I wondered if I were making a mistake, if meeting the people that I met and asking about the deep blows they'd sustain would just tip me over the edge. I thought that all these tragic stories might crush me under their weight and that I would never get out of bed again. Instead, the opposite happened. It's given me hope. What people can get through is absolutely amazing. I've been stunned and astonished at what I've learned, and I hope all of you will be interested as well to read the book, and that you will be stunned and amazed by human beings as well. I wish I had some sort of wise scroll to unfurl before you with all of the lessons that I've learned, which probably shows that even with all that I've looked at, I still struggle to confront the vagaries of fate head on, and that I still feel like there's a need for lessons to be learned. Nonetheless, if there's anything I've taken away, it's to be grateful for the ordinary days, because they're not so ordinary really, they're quite magical. Hindsight makes them quite magical. I'd like to leave you with something from the book Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. It's an 1859 translation by Edward Fitzgerald of the works of Persian astronomer poet Omar Khayyam, which I think pretty much perfectly sums up in 2 verses much of what I've learned in 4 years of writing and research. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. And that inverted bowl we call the sky, whereunder crawling, cooped, we live and die. Lift not thy hands to it for help, for it rolls impotently on as thou or I. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful series of stories, drawing upon your own experience and the experience of those you have met in the journey of writing this book. I was promised, however, by David that this interview would happen at 7:30. So we need to... I beg your indulgence if we sort of string this out for another 15 minutes so we can say after this evening that we interviewed Leigh Sales at 7:30. A number of questions have been sent in by students through the UQMS for this evening, and I have the task, both as a sort of medical dean and as a psychiatrist, to make sense of them and to prioritise these questions and continue the conversation a little bit further.
I should be asking you questions. So, I think I was trying to get control, wasn't I? With this 4 years of book, I was trying to impose control on something uncontrollable.
Well, let's start with that. So, why do you ask that?
At least give me a couch to lie on.
You've told us a lot about what you've learned from others. What have you learned about yourself? Why have you been able to adapt?
I think that I think a lot of people learn this, I am way more resilient than I had any idea that I was, and things, if you'd said to me 5 years ago, this is what you'll be doing and you'll be dealing with, I would have said, well, I can't do that. Like, I don't want to do that and I can't do that. And I can. You just learn that you can cope with way more than you think you could. I have learned to get much better at accepting help from people. And so when people say, oh, look, let me know if there's anything I could do to help, I'll go, yeah, that'd be great if you could come around on Saturday and take the kids for 2 hours. I do not have any qualms, whereas previously I was the sort of person that would have said, no, I can deal with things myself. And I've learnt, I think, that of all of the human qualities, I think kindness is the most important. I would have probably said before 2014, if you'd said to me who were among your friends your favourites, I probably would have said, the really smart ones, the funny ones, the ones that, when you have dinner, you're laughing for about 3 days afterwards at the recollection of stuff that was said. But now I still love people like that, but I have far more value on the kind ones, and I've also I'm so conscious myself of trying to be kind and help people when they need it.
The theme of kindness comes through very much in your book, and you draw attention to that in that sort of horrible series of events which resulted in you going into the operating theatre, and the nurse reaching under the cover to sort of hold your hand.
Yeah, that made a big impact on me at the time, because it was an acknowledgement that there was a human being in the centre of what was going on, and it was an acknowledgement that I was suffering and that was someone attempting to comfort me. And so in some ways, of course, I'm not processing like this at the time, of course, but in hindsight, I think what it said to me was, you're scared and it's right for you to be scared. And it sort of acknowledged that. And so her kindness in that moment, really did, make a difference to me.
I suppose the theme of kindness and sort of empathy, you give some advice to journalists in your book about how they should interact with and be present with individuals who've experienced trauma.
And I think it's probably pertinent as well for doctors, which is for journos, when you come across somebody, every day I'm dealing with people that something awful's happened to. So on one sense for me, it's another story. It's just another story. In the same way that for doctors, it's another patient. But actually for that person, it's the first time that their house has burned down. It's the first time they've been told they have cancer. And what I learned in talking to people is that it was hurtful to them if they felt like they had been treated as just another story. They wanted to be treated like they were a human being. And I think when your job all the time is involving you being in these situations, and you have pressures that the people in the centre might not be aware of, you might be under deadline pressure, your boss might be riding you because you've been scooped the day before or whatever. There's pressures that come to bear that sometimes mean that you lose sight that the person at the centre is a person, not just a case. And I think there's also the interplay of your natural empathy as a human being and your need when you work in these professions to have a level of self-preservation. So you can't empathise as much as you would if it was a friend, because you wouldn't be able to do your job, but you need to allow a little bit of that empathy to creep in so that you treat them like a person, not like a story.
I think you develop it further as well when you talk about being present, which I think you sort of take from the meeting with Father Steve Sin.
Yeah, so one of the things that came through when I spoke to people to whom something awful had happened, particularly when it was a really horrible thing, like, say, for example, there's a man in the book, Walter Mikac, whose wife and 6-year-old and 3-year-old were all killed in the Port Arthur massacre. He found that, and this was common to many other people in the book, people would avoid him in the aftermath because they didn't know what to say, and they just feared it because it was such a horrible thing that had happened, and it was just too hard for some people. And Walter said to me, people would say later, I didn't want to see you because I felt like I might say the wrong thing and that I might make it worse. And Walter said to me, my wife and my 3-year-old and my 6-year-old had been killed. What does anyone think they can say that can make that worse? Like, you can't make that worse. The only thing that makes it worse is when the poor person in the centre of it feels like a pariah because nobody wants to talk to them anymore. And Walter explained it in a very articulate way, which was that he'd had this terrible loss, and then it was compounded by further loss because people attempted to avoid him. Michael Spence, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney Uni, who I interviewed as well, lost his wife, and they had 5 children, the youngest was 4, and she was diagnosed with cancer and she died 3 weeks later. And when he was getting ready, he hadn't been Vice-Chancellor at Sydney Uni very long, and it's really hard when you have a very public job like that as well, and you've got to be on. And he went to see a priest, and the priest said, you realise when you go back to work, you're going to have to be the person to make this, to put everyone at ease. And Michael was like, what? Like, I'm the one whose wife died. And the priest said, yeah, but if you don't, it's going to remain the elephant in the room, and you'll find it better if you just deal with it. And so Michael would go into meetings and say, could I just begin by acknowledging, thank you for all the lovely messages I've received about Beth, and, blah, blah, blah. And then it was sort of dealt with, and it freed people from feeling like they had to think of the right thing to say. But this priest, Father Steve Sin, I went to speak to him because he'd been very helpful to the woman I mentioned before, Juliet Darling, who Graham Norris, the homicide detective, had worked with as well. And she mentioned how this priest just always seemed to know how to do and say the right thing. So I went to talk to him to ask how did he know how to say and do the right thing. And he said, oh, well, I don't. And I said, yeah, but you did though, so explain it. And he said, no, it's not about doing or saying the right thing, because that's a really selfish way of looking at it. You're there to just accompany the person through what they're going through and to be present. And if you say the wrong thing, who cares? Doesn't matter. Like, you just need to demonstrate that you're there, and it's you need to be thinking about the other person. And so I found the combination of Walter sharing what had happened to him and then Steve Sin explaining that so clearly really helped me. I had a friend with terminal cancer towards the end of writing this book, and I think that I would have previously been very scared to go up to him in hospital. I have low tolerance for sort of what I would consider gross medical sort of things, and so I'd be worried I'd say the wrong thing, or if he was upset and crying that would be upsetting. But I became sort of liberated after Steve said this thing to me, and I felt like, well, it's not about me, and if I think that's gross, it's about Mark. And so I just used to bumble up there, and I'm sure I was, a pain, and I still was scared, and I still, if the nurse came in and was draining his lungs or whatever, I'd still be like, oh God. But I just did it because it wasn't about me, it was about Mark. And if, I'd accompanied Mark to the pub on many an occasion, I'd accompanied Mark at all sorts of things, so I should at the very least accompany Mark, when he most needs it. Even my own father died a few months ago, and I felt much more certain in the decision that I needed to be there when he died. And I think had I not written this book, I would have been much more scared about that. And I was still scared, but I knew from talking to other people that I would ultimately feel better if I just accompanied right to the very end.
You have a wonderful command of language, but one of the words that comes through in the book which you question its utility is survivor. Why is that? Yeah,
there was two words that I came to dislike. One's closure and the other one's survivor. Because I think that we often talk about people being survivors, or, he survived the Port Arthur massacre, he survived the Thredbo landslide. Saying that someone survived something implied that it was an event and that the survival, was done and dusted at the time of that event. You survived it, end of story. But what you realise when people have a terrible thing happen to them is that it's more like endurance. It's not survival, it's endurance, because it carries on often for your whole life that you're enduring what's occurred. And the pain of it is often, it doesn't remain as acute as it does in the initial years afterwards. Over time, it becomes more contained, but you still will have 20 years on a bad day, so therefore I think endurance is a better word than survival. Closure, people talk about, we need to, you should go to the inquest so you can have closure or whatever. It's just such BS. Because there's never, if your two children have been killed, there's not closure. Like, you're not going to have closure. Nothing's going to occur that's going to make that, end. It's more just, as I say, the endurance and dealing with it. Graham Norris, the homicide detective, explained this really well, because he said he often would be aware when he started on this journey with people that they didn't know it, but he knew that they were going to have a very long association. And he knew that there was lots of times at which it can derail, because you might not be able to apprehend the perpetrator. There might not be enough evidence to charge. They might get off at trial. It might get overturned on an appeal. The sentence might not be as long as they like. And he said, even if everything goes right and, the person gets life, often the family will be dissatisfied, and it's because they don't realise it consciously, but unconsciously what they want at the end of the process is for the person to be back. And so therefore they never actually get the outcome that they really want, and that's one of the reasons why there's never closure.
In your book also you develop the theme of making mistakes and talk about how journalists often make mistakes, how you've made mistakes in your career. What advice would you have for medical students and junior doctors for whom one of the biggest fears they have is that they're going to make a mistake as they move into the clinical environment?
firstly, you are going to make them. So I know it is scary, and you just have to accept that you are going to make them, and it will be terrible, and you'll have to come to terms with that. After what happened to me when I had James, my son, I just had a sense of how easily that could have gone absolutely catastrophically wrong. Like, had I not been at hospital, had I been sent home, had my obstetrician been in the middle of delivering another baby and there'd been a delay, or there were just so many ways in which that could have, been an absolute disaster. I read a book called Complications by Atul Gawande, which I highly recommend. And he talks about exactly this question about you are going to make mistakes, how do you deal with it? As a journalist, I look back over my career, and I think most of the mistakes I've made I could put down to what I talked about in the first answer, which is a failure of empathy, where I've lost sight, for whatever reason, that the person at the centre of the story is actually a human being. And so, for example, one example I give was in Hurricane Katrina. I was under deadline pressure. I'm trying to get someone who can talk about what's happened to them. And there was this elderly woman who had sort of 5 children with her. She'd lost track of certain family members. And when I was interviewing her, she was really good talent, and she was crying and distressed, and I can't find so-and-so, and I can't find so-and-so, and blah, blah, blah. And she was speaking. And as she was going, I was thinking, this is really good. I need, her to keep going for a few more minutes, so I've got enough material for my story. I was doing it for radio, so I had a microphone and was recording it. And there was one of the kids with her was a boy, her grandson, who looked about 11. And he said to me, at a certain point, 'cause she was getting more and more upset, he said quietly, "That's enough." And I knew that I didn't have enough for my story. And so I asked one more question and kept going. And then he said a bit more loudly, "That's enough." And now I look back and go, oh my God, an 11-year-old had to tell me when that was enough. And I think that what I could have done is asked, would you like to keep going or would you like to end it? Your grandson's worried about you. Like, give her the control of the situation. If she wanted to keep talking, then, she could keep talking. It doesn't always have to be... I think allowing people to take control of a situation sometimes is helpful to them. So I should have allowed her to make the decision at that point if she wanted to keep going. Or I should have just accepted, I've got 45 seconds, I'll find another person quickly now, and then moved on to do something else. At the time, I was just like, I've got to get this, got to get that, blah, blah, blah. So I try now I'm more experienced, so I try to keep that front and centre, but... I'm sure I'll make more mistakes, as will all of you, because we're human.
We are indeed. Are there any circumstances, however, when you don't like giving control to the person you're interviewing?
Politicians. It's with people who've been traumatised, giving them space and allowing them to tell what's happened to them is very important, and not, cutting them off or not pushing them into areas that they don't want to talk about. So say, for example, with Walter Mikak, when I met him, one of the things I was curious about was he was a pharmacist, and so nobody has more knowledge or means than a pharmacist to kill yourself. And I was privately curious to think, man, what happened to him was so terrible. Like, how did he not do that? But I would not have raised that had he not raised it first, because I think that does cross a line to ask somebody, why didn't you kill yourself? So he, when we were talking, said something like, in the immediate aftermath of what had happened, that people would sometimes see his car parked late at night outside his pharmacy, and they would speculate about what he was doing there. And so he was the one who opened the door to the question of, was he there because he was going to kill himself? And so then I felt that because he raised it, gave me permission to say, what stopped you? Why didn't you? And then because he was the one who had led us there, he was, comfortable to say, well, I didn't because I was very close with my parents, and I felt that they had, I certainly thought about it, but my parents had had all this suffering already because they'd lost their grandchildren, and I didn't want to add to their suffering. And I couldn't quite extinguish the hope that maybe, even though right this very minute everything was horrendous, maybe in the future it might get better. Maybe when the trial's over it might be better. And he couldn't quite extinguish that hope. But it's not the sort of thing that I would have asked had he not raised it. And also with other people in the book who I ask similar, there's one person in the book whose husband was killed in a surfing accident who talks to me about what happened at the morgue when she went to see his body. I pretty much sat there not saying anything. I would say, then what happened? And just let her speak. Because then she's empowered there. It's not me saying, so when you walked in to see Matt's body, what did he look like? That's a terrible way to interview somebody who's talking about something like that. So I tried to just be very gentle, and now I do it at 7:30 with people if they're coming on to do an interview. I recently had one of the people, Matthew Lowe, whose wife had been one of the people killed at the Dreamworld accident. And, when we sit down, I say, before we roll, I say, Matthew, you're going to be the one driving. I'm just going to be helping you talk about what you want to talk about. And I approach it like that. When it's a politician, of course, it's a different kind of interview. It's what I'd call an accountability interview. So you're doing the exact opposite, which is you're forcing them to answer what you want them to answer. Totally different skill set.
Well, thank you very much. I'm mindful that we've moved across to 7:30, so we have had an opportunity to interview Leigh Sales at 7:30. In the last 2 quick questions, if I may, from medical students. So first question is, what's the moment in your career you're most proud of?
I hate answering questions like that because it makes me feel up myself.
But we'll allow you to do that. You have permission.
I think that what we do at 7:30, every day, I am proud of, and I think it is important, particularly at this time of, post-truth world and stuff, and where facts seem to not matter. We try really hard to adhere to, facts do matter, and being objective and being fair and all of that kind of stuff. So I am proud of that. I can't help but also just think about stuff that my job, as well as the kind of people I've talked about tonight, I just get to meet the most amazing and interesting people at the top of their game. So, last year I got to meet Paul McCartney, which I am a massive Beatles fan, and I just found that unbelievable that some little brat from Brisbane got to meet Paul McCartney. Even this week I interviewed Shane Warne, who I'd always wanted to interview because I find him a very interesting and unique sort of figure. And he bizarrely was so open and honest. I've never interviewed somebody that was just so blah, 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 blah. And that is, it's a really... I guess it's like any field when you hit sort of flow or you're in the zone where everything's flowing, and for me it's when you're having a conversation and I end up not having to do that much because the person's responding so well that I just steer. And so with Shane, it was this feeling of... it was just a really pleasurable feeling as it started going. I was thinking, this is riveting, and he's not defensive or stonewalling or anything. Seems like I can pretty much ask him absolutely anything and he's going to answer it. And so that is that often doesn't happen, because with the pollies it's the exact opposite. And so when somebody's being like that, it's the greatest feeling. And when they leave, you don't want to show too much how elated you are at how well it's gone. So Warnie's sort of left, and I'm like, gosh, thanks very much, Shane, that was fantastic. And as soon as the producer and I got in the cab, we were like, oh my god, that was unbelievable.
So, Leigh, what's next? If you could interview anyone, you've already met Paul McCartney. Who else?
I'd be pretty keen to interview Barack Obama. People often ask would I like to interview Donald Trump. I think if I came off and there was a message on my phone to say we've landed Trump, a small part would feel happy because it's a good get. 99% of me would think, oh God, because they are the hardest people to interview, because if you work in the realm of sort of logic and reason, interviewing someone who does not operate in that realm is very difficult. And so, it's like trying to swat a fly where, they've landed somewhere, and so you swat, and then before you can swat, the fly's buzzed off, somewhere else. And so that kind of erratic way of thinking and speaking is very hard to interview. And also just the level of hate and trolling that you would get, I think, if I interviewed Trump in the way that I interview most pollies, I think would be overwhelming. So I'd be dreading all of that, but I would still do it, because it's I think one of the things I think in life is and again that I've learnt over the years, is it's just better to say yes to things usually, because lots of stuff that I do pushes me a long way out of my comfort zone, and it's always the anticipation of doing things and the anxiety of like hosting election night or something like that is very high. But the feeling of once you've done it is so great. And also, for me, the idea that, someone else might be interviewing Paul McCartney or Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or whoever, because I was too scared. I hate the idea that I would miss out on having some great adventures because I was too scared. So I tend to be, I think, the Nike Just Do It slogan, I think, is the greatest advertising slogan ever. Because I often on everything in terms of, procrastinating on things that are unpleasant that I don't want to do, to visiting friends with cancer, to dropping off a meal to somebody, to hosting election night, to interviewing the Prime Minister, I think, just do it.
What a wonderful place to end. Thank you very much for all your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
very much.